The Long Road by Wolfland. After a hearty breakfast the next morning, it was time for Stephen and his team to take their leave. It took a good amount of effort for Mrs. Evans to contain her tears when Stephen made his way to the door. "Stephen?" Her voice caused him to pause with a hand on the knob. "I think your father would very much like it if you came home every now and again. He misses you, you know." As much as he loved his father, Stephen couldn't completely squash the pang of disappointment that rose up at the housekeeper's words. It wasn't often that his father was home to see him when he was younger, so naturally, he wouldn't have thought twice about actually visiting home once he'd left on his journey. He very nearly said as much, but instead, he swallowed his admission as he turned and offered a small smile. Mrs. Evans wasn't the target of his ire. "I'll try." "Thank you, dear. Now, get going and save this old woman the embarrassment of crying over seeing you walk out that door again," she sniffled and dabbled at the corner of her eye. This time, Stephen's smile was genuine, and he moved forward to give her one last hug before stepping through the door with a wave goodbye. As the door clicked shut, Mrs. Evans cracked a tearful smile. "Your mother would have been so proud to see what a fine young man you've become." Stephen waited until he was well beyond the Rustboro city limits before he stopped. Once he had closed the door behind him, he beat a hasty retreat towards the Rusturf Hills, intent on getting out of the city before he changed his mind. Now that the fresh air of the route hit his face, he finally felt content enough to reveal his plan to everyone. 6 flashes of light appeared, and before his Pokemon could react, Stephen dipped into a bow. "I'm sorry, everyone." Several confused glances were shared at both his statement and their distinctly not gym-like surroundings. "There's been a change of plans since yesterday." He paused as he straightened, and Aggron's gaze narrowed as it rumbled in concern. "We won't be going for our last badge just yet." His Pokemon's questioning cries mingled together, leaving a knot at the base of his throat. I have a selfish request." He took a deep breath. "At some point, every trainer's journey must come to an end. We're close, so close, and yet I don't think I'm ready for our time together to be over." Credilli's quiet warble nearly cracked his composure, but he recovered. "I want to travel with you for as long as I can, and the best way to do that is to win it all. But in the event that we don't, I want to make the most of the time we still have, which is why I want to ask you to journey with me again." Nervousness took over, and the words just tumbled out as he hurried to follow up. "We can go see things we haven't seen before, revisit old places to see how much we've grown, meet new people, and face new challenges. And I want to do it all with you by my side, because—" Stephen swallowed. The knot had doubled in size, and he found himself unable to meet his Pokemon's patient stares. "Because if we get all the way to the end, and we aren't good enough, I don't think I could handle knowing we didn't do everything in our power to be the best. I made a promise long ago that I would become a good trainer, and I intend to make good on that promise." The sound of the wind through the trees was deafening as he finally drew his gaze back towards his team. 6 sets of eyes were locked unwaveringly on his. "So, what do you say?" The chorus of enthusiastic cries that poured forth almost left him weak in the knees. Even Skarmory joined in, sharing a sharp but confident glance, and Stephen found himself grinning in return. It was a unanimous decision. They would reach the top. Anything less was not an option. The hike through Rusturf Hills was as uneventful as Stephen had hoped it would be. He was certain, with a menagerie of 6 powerful Pokemon at his side, he was sure to either attract unwanted attention or scare everyone off. Thankfully, neither extreme happened, and with only a short detour to avoid disturbing the local Wismer colony, their group managed to trek with little difficulty. For the particularly steep sections, Agron was happy to offer Credilli a ride on his back, with Matang doing the same for their trainer. Even Skarmory was content to behave, soaring peacefully overhead as they set foot in Verdanturf town. The sleepy town had little to offer in the way of excitement, with only a small contest hall as its main attraction, but the fresh air and lush scenery helped to put Stephen's mind at ease. He was the first person to admit that maybe his decision to put their gym challenge on hold could potentially backfire. All during the Rusturf hike, he had turned over every scenario in his mind until they jumbled together, making him frown until Matang gave him a worried chirp. Would they lose momentum by taking time off? What if they delayed too long, and his father pulled him into the world of Devon before they got to challenge the league? The hike back to Rasboro was still a short one, if he talked himself out of it before they got too far. But what if all this hurrying meant that they weren't strong enough to take on the league? And yet, how strong of a trainer could he truly be if his starter hadn't even fully evolved by now? But as another breath of clean, crisp air filled his lungs, his worries seemed to melt away. Spying a nearby bench, Stephen slung his pack from his shoulder and sank down onto the seat with a contented sigh. His eyes slid over the small park, and it looked as if the rest of his Pokémon shared the same sentiment. Credilli had fanned herself out in a sunny patch, while Armaldo and Claydol were engaged in what appeared to be some sort of game that left both Pokémon giggling. Agron, too, seemed happy to just relax, as it already had curled up on a patch of grass and begun snoozing. Stephen couldn't hide a chuckle as the nearby daisies danced back and forth in front of its nostrils. Matang had just settled itself by Stephen's side when a small voice spoke up from nearby.
Excuse me? Are these all your Pokémon?
Stephen followed his partner's gaze to find a young girl staring at the park where his Pokémon had gathered. She was not much older than a beginning trainer would be, and as she clutched the skitty in her arms a bit tighter, the wonder written in her eyes belied her nervous fascination. He gave her a reassuring smile. "They are? Would you like to meet them?" Matang hovered up from where it was resting, but the girl simply shook her head.
It's okay. I don't want to bother them. It's just, I don't see many Pokémon like yours come through here.
She pried her gaze away from Credilli's sunbathing form to meet Matang's own stare. It gave a quiet hum as it looked quizzically at its young admirer.
Your Pokémon, they look so happy. You must be really great friends.
The girl's soft statement caught him by surprise, and Stephen turned toward her with a curious expression. She watched Matang for only a moment longer before meeting Stephen's gaze with a grin of her own.
It really loves you, you know.
Stephen blinked at her directness, but before he could press further, a matronly voice cut through the air, and she spun to face the call.
Coming, Mama!
The little girl wheeled back around and gave Stephen a short bow, causing her skitty to complain as it was rocked forward in her arms.
Thanks for letting me say hi to your Pokémon!
And with that, she scampered away in the direction of her mother's voice. Stephen sat in stunned silence as the little girl rounded the corner and disappeared. Shaking his head, he rose from the bench, but not before catching the way Matang's gaze seemed to linger on his. That same look from back in Rasboro, a look that made it impossible not to smile. Because through all his shortcomings and miscalculations and poor judgment, Matang stuck by his side. All his Pokémon had, and for the remainder of their evening in Verdanturf, the only thing that echoed inside his mind was the sincerity of that little girl he'd met in the park.